Welcome to Brain Vision.
Okay, so in this question, we have a tube that has a length of 0.730 meters. And we're told that a student listening to the tube experiences natural frequencies at 235 hertz and 587 hertz. And we are supposed to explain why this can't be possible. So the way that we do this, we have to consider what happens when the tube is, we're told that the student doesn't know whether the tube is open at both ends or closed at one end. And we have to, so in order to solve this problem, we have to consider what happens in both situations, whether the tube is open at one end or open at both ends. So the easiest way to go about this is just to consider both situations, and in both scenarios, find the fundamental frequency and then figure out what the natural frequencies of the tube are. So I'm going to start with a tube that is open on both ends. So I'll just call this open. And in this case, the length of the tube, L, is equal to lambda over 2, which hopefully you're familiar with by now at this point in the chapter. There's been several problems similar to that, but I will draw a quick picture anyway. So if we have a tube that's open at both ends, then there has to be an antinode at either end. So when we're trying to find the fundamental frequency, there's an antinode at either end, and then there has to be one node in the middle. And then we can see that this length of the tube then has to be 1/2 the length of the standing wave in the tube. Has to be 1/2 the length of the full wavelength, because we go from one antinode to the opposite antinode, but we have to go back to the original antinode, which would be twice the length of the tube. Therefore, the length of the tube is half the wavelength, and twice the length of the tube is equal to 1 wavelength. So then from here, in order to calculate the fundamental, we have to say that the fundamental frequency is going to be equal to speed of sound divided by the wavelength, which we can substitute in 2L for. So V divided by 2L, we know the length of the tube and we know the speed of sound. We're assuming it's 343 meters per second because we haven't been told otherwise in the problem. So the fundamental frequency for the tube with this length, if it was open at both ends, would be 343 divided by 2 times 0.730. If you calculate that, you'll get that the fundamental frequency is 235 hertz, which is great because that is one of the frequencies that we're looking for. So then we have to figure out whether or not 587 is a fundamental or is a resonant frequency, is a natural frequency of the tube in this situation. So for a tube that's open at both ends, the resonant frequencies, the natural frequencies above the fundamental, will be integer multiples of the fundamental frequency. So what we do is we just start taking integer multiples of 235, and we will stop if we get above 587, because once we get above 587, we're not going to find 587 as a higher frequency, obviously. So the next resonant frequency is going to be F2, and that'll be 2 times 235 hertz. And that is equal to 470 hertz. Okay, so 587 could still be a natural harmonic, a natural frequency of this tube. It's higher than 470. We haven't passed it yet, so we'll go ahead and check the next one. So F3 will be 3 times 235, sorry. And when you calculate that out, you find that the third natural frequency is 705 hertz. So that means that we've passed 587 hertz, and it is pretty clearly not a natural frequency of the tube, which means that for an open tube, 587 hertz is not a natural frequency. So the tube can't be open at both ends. So we know that this scenario is impossible. So now we can move on to the scenario of what if the tube is open at only one end and it's closed at the other. So I'll call this close. So now, once again, we have to figure out what the fundamental frequency would be in this situation. And in this case, the length of the tube would then be the fundamental wavelength divided by 4, or the length, 4 times the length of the tube would be equal to lambda. I'll draw a quick picture just to demonstrate this. If it's closed at one end, then we need to have a node at one end and at the closed end and an antinode at the open end. So the fundamental frequency would look like this. A bit neater though. And so we've gone from a node to one antinode. Twice that length would take us from that antinode back to a node. 3 times the length of the tube would bring us from the second node to the opposite antinode, and 4 times the length of the tube would bring us from that opposite antinode back to the original node. So the full wavelength is 4 times the length of the tube. So now we do the same calculation as we did before, where we're trying to find the fundamental frequency. So F1 is equal to V divided by lambda, where lambda is the fundamental wavelength. But we know that 4L is equal to lambda, so we can sub that in. V equals 4L. And V and L are the same as we did in the first part. So the fundamental frequency is 343 divided by 4 times 0.730. And you calculate that, and then your fundamental frequency for this tube, if it's closed at one end, is 117 hertz. So this doesn't really tell us anything immediately, because this is not either of the frequencies that we're looking for. But now we can start looking for the upper harmonics to see if 235 or 537 are upper harmonics. So in order for this we want to prove that the situation that was described in the problem is impossible. In order for it to be possible, both 235 and 587 have to be natural harmonics of this tube. So in order to do that, we need to find the natural harmonics, and 235 and 587 both have to be included in that series. But because the tube is closed at one end, the natural harmonics of this tube are not just integer multiples of the fundamental frequency. They're only the odd integer multiples. So 1 times the fundamental, 3 times the fundamental, and 5 times the fundamental, and so on. So the next resonant frequency of this tube will actually be F3 instead of F2. It'll be 3 times 117 hertz. And if you calculate that, that gives us that 352 is a resonant frequency, is the next resonant frequency after the fundamental. This already rules out that 235 could ever be, a natural harmonic of this tube. So we already know that this situation is impossible. But if you're wondering where 587 came from, if we do the next one, 5 times 117 will give us 587 hertz. you may notice that these numbers don't quite work out exactly. There are some decimals after 117, but for round off, when you round it to the right number of significant figures, the fundamental is just 117. But you'll want to keep those decimal points when you're doing your calculations. So if you keep those decimal points, you will get 5 times the fundamental frequency is 587 hertz, which is where we get the 587 from the problem. So yeah, so for the closed scenario, 235 hertz is not a natural frequency, and therefore the situation is not possible. The tube can't be closed at one end. So yeah, so we've proven that both scenarios don't work. Both scenarios have one of the two natural frequencies, but they don't have both. So we've proven that this situation is impossible to have both 235 and 287 be natural frequencies of this tube. So the reason this is impossible is there is no possible shape for the tube that would produce both 235 hertz and 587 hertz as a natural frequency. A closed tube can only produce 587 hertz as a natural frequency, and an open tube can only produce 235 hertz as a natural frequency, but neither can produce both. Therefore, this situation is impossible. I will let you write that down so that you don't have to waste time watching me write it. But yeah, so there you go. That's how you do this question.